Hello, this is part 2 of the Brilliance of Sword and Sorcery with Brian Murphy. If you want to know the context of what we're talking about here, I highly implore you to watch that video. Alright, on with part 2. One of the reasons I guess Sword and Sorcery is so I don't know, I guess misused or overused is because of how varied stylistically these authors were. I think a good branching point is Fritz Leiber, because he had quite an interesting take a lot on Howard and how he implemented some of his elements into his own.
You know, he was an interesting guy. His father was an actor. He himself was an actor. He read Shakespeare. So he was not just definitely not a Howard clone. And but at the same time, he wrote very widely as well. So he did a lot of horror. He did science fiction, but he returned to these same two characters again and again throughout his literary career, the Faffer and the Grey Mouser. You're looking at, 1939, I believe, was the first appearance of those two characters in Unknown, and then he was writing about them all the way up through the end of his life. Some of his latter stuff, probably not quite as good. You have The Knight and the Knave of Swords, which was published in 1988, for example. It didn't actually, his first stuff was like 1934, now that I think about it. So he's got a lot of history with these characters. And there are echoes of Howard in there. You know, you look at Bafford, who's the 7-foot northern barbarian. You already associate the barbarian Conan and barbarian Fafford. But, very, very different. A lot more witty. Urbane is a word you sometimes hear about him. A lot more sophisticated in terms of the way they speak. A lot less coarse. A lot of banter and joking. Humor makes its way into his stuff a lot more. I think he is a phenomenal stylist. Like Fritz Leiber, if you want to look at just how to write well, good writing. Read Fritz Leiber, man.
Pools of light on the green poker tables alternated with hourglass shapes of exciting gloom. By the jazz stand, belly dancers made their white hourglass shapes. The gamblers were thick and hunched down as mushrooms, all bald from agonizing over the fall of a card or a die or the dive of an ivory ball, while the scarlet women were like fields of poinsettia.
And incredibly inventive, too. You look at something like, Bazaar of the Bazaar, where the two of them are in Lankmar. I think one of the things that Leiber did really well that Howard did not was he created this. Howard created worlds. He created the Hyborian Age. But Leiber created this, his amazing creation to me, besides those two characters, was the city of Lankmar itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just feels real and lived in. And in Bazaar of the Bazaar, these two guys, they stumble into, it's basically like a magic shop, but it's all fraud being perpetuated by these beings that are basically are illusionists, and they're everything that the Mouser thinks is this just amazing artifact, this priceless relic, this beautiful woman is actually rubbish and shit, or this thing he thinks is a beautiful voluptuous woman is a nasty spider, and he's enchanted, and Fafford is not. So this clash of what he's seeing versus the other guy, and the dialogue they have makes it absolutely hilarious. Leiber's literary career, his early stuff is generally considered his best. His early stuff up and through the midpoint of his career until like the late 60s is generally considered like his peak material. Later in life he kept writing, as I said, all the way up through near his death in the early 90s. But he kind of backfilled in these guys' backstories. He introduced us much like Howard did, right in the middle of adventure. He doesn't build up who these guys are, where they came from, what they were like as youths. It was just boom, here they are in an adventure, and then we'll fill in as we go. But he did wind up writing these origin stories. He wrote one for Fafford the Barbarian called The Snow Women, and Fafford is living in a patriarchal society. It's women dominated, and it's very backwards. It's hidebound. There is not a lot of room for personal freedom. They're kind of seen, and he's chafing against this, and he wants to get out of it. So there you have Leiber portraying barbarians as in not nearly as positive a light as Howard did. So there's one difference there, and as you also said, these guys are constantly wanting to go to the city because there is a lot going on. It's where the action's happening. There's adventure to be had. There are riches to be found there, wonders to be seen. But then eventually they get tired of the city too, because it's corrupt. Well, another story that he wrote, Lords of Quarmal, is really a critique of the industrial city and how it corrupts human beings, and cash is all powerful, and they reject that as well. And they will actually wind up at the end, and I think in a really cool it's sort of you've got the excesses of barbarians on the one end, civilization on the other end. Well, they wind up in a place called Rime Isle, which in a way is a little bit of both. It's sort of their hero's end retreat. I think he was trying to resolve that tension with some of his later material. Whether he was successful with it, I'll leave that up to the readers. Some people find some of the stuff in there objectionable, but his stuff was definitely more nuanced with that take. Like Howard pretty much came down and said, we're all of this civilization is ultimately doomed to corruption and downfall and overthrow, and then it'll start over again. It was very cyclical. And Leiber kind of had his own take on that.
Like if you get into Conan, I think Fritz Leiber is like your second author to go.
Yeah, I would agree. I would have to say he's my. I think his best stuff is as good as Howard's. I give Howard probably the edge just because he originated this, and Howard, his Conan stuff is probably more consistent.
Yeah.
If you look at story for story, some of Fritz's later stuff is just not as good. He was doing different things with it, and it kind of got away from what made the early stuff really good. But at his peak, you can argue he was a better writer. Mm-hmm. You can make that case if you want. But it's not really about who's better than who. It's just I think they were both playing. They were both. I mean, Howard originated, but they were both in the sword and sorcery space, doing innovative work in it and doing stuff that was different and still puts you in that sword and sorcery camp. It gives you a lot of different things to think about and different styles to play with. And then Moorcock, he was basically writing in sort of, in a way, direct opposition to Howard. He created the anti-Conan with Elric of Melniboné. Elric was a albino who depended on a cocktail of drugs for his strength. So this was not a guy who was some jack barbarian who was just physically superior to everybody else. He had to take drugs to get him there. He was not afraid to use magic. Very different than Conan. He was a civilized emperor from a long, long line of emperors. Very different than what we think of with a traditional, working class sword and sorcery hero. And yet, he belongs in this circle. He was influenced by Howard. He's written some equivocal things about Howard. Occasionally, he said some critical stuff of him, but
Oh yes.
he had yeah. But in general, he's given Howard his due, and he was inspired by Howard. He took what Howard did and did something different. But
Yeah.
again, still in that sword and sorcery mold. Still was writing for the pulp magazines, principally for Fantastic and other magazines.
I mean, a lot of people say Elric is an anti-hero, but I really do think of him as a tragic hero. He doesn't belong anywhere. He doesn't belong in Melibene. He doesn't belong in the Young Kingdoms, so to speak.
Yep.
He's weak. He's dependent on drugs and also Stormbringer, which is, man, that's like such a horrifying but really cool concept. Like this,
I know, isn't it?
like he wields it, but he's
Not
not.
enough just to kill someone. It has to
He suck
steal
its
their
soul.
and
Yeah.
condemn them to hell. Condemn them to torment.
Like damn, and like again,
Yeah.
it's but also the fact that the sword is sentient. It sings, it moans. It's really creepy. Absolutely phenomenal character, Elric. I can't recommend him
Oh, yeah.
enough. I can't recommend him enough.
I know. I think Moorcock is a genius with creation. I mean, arguably, is he as good a writer as Fritz Leiber? I'm not sure, but he's an excellent writer. But I think his particular genius is just in his imagination.
Yeah.
I mean, the characters he created, the world he created, the whole concept of the multiverse, that these characters can exist in different planes and they have different manifestations, but they're all this eternal champion. It wasn't necessarily his concept, but law and chaos. Michael Moorcock was influenced by Poul Anderson, who wrote a phenomenal book, by the way, called The Broken Sword, which I can't recommend highly enough. But he took that concept and really expanded it with his stories.
I know this is like a massive topic, but how would you like define that conflict?
So the brilliance there is they can't exist independent of each other.
Yeah.
Like too much law is a bad thing because then everything becomes stifled and conformist. Too much chaos leads to complete disorder. So there has to be a balance. And the great struggle in those books is to find that balance. It's really almost impossible, but and there's a concept of the city of Tanalorn that Elric's trying to get to, and it's hard to find, and it's always just out of his grasp, but it's where actually life is in equilibrium, and at least it's sort of a paradise, or that's the way it's. He never portrays it as directly, but it's there as a concept. It's sort of like the Holy Grail. It's a place that he's striving to get to because law and chaos are always out of alignment.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it's important to say because I think that's again you go back to D&D. Lawful has always been a connotation of good, and
Yeah.
it's very clear that that's not the case. Law in the total ascendancy, could arguably become something like Nazi Germany even,
Yeah.
where it's just controlled from the top down and it's conformist and it tramples on creativity and it doesn't allow for dissidence to arise, and it's not a good thing.
Yeah.
But again, chaos. Well, we see what happens if chaos takes over. Like cities crumble. There's anarchy and that's what I like with the stories too. There is no good and evil. There is no like I'm rooting for this guy because he's the good guy. It's really a guy who's just trying to bring some order into the universe and maybe get away from the worst excesses of the Melnibonéans and find something new and find Tanalorn.
It's still underground, but I do think it adds to it. Obviously, the Whetstone and the Tales of the Magician's Skull. Yeah, I mean, you obviously are in contact with a lot of these guys, so if you want to, talk about this stuff.
No, yeah, I'm really encouraged by what I'm seeing in contemporary sword and sorcery. So there is a server on Discord called Whetstone, which is run by a guy by the name of Jason Ray Carney. He started also a magazine. It's digital only. It's free, so he's just going for most eyeballs he can on it. I don't believe he pays his authors, or he pays them like a nominal fee.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a small amount. But the point here is it's labeled as amateur. He just wants to get authors out there writing in this space. But that's a great mechanism. I give him a ton of credit. He's been building up a community around this in this Whetstone server. And from that, we're starting to see a lot more spin out. Now, subsequent and actually prior to Whetstone, the premier publisher for Sword and Sorcery, in my opinion, is still DMR Books.
Yes.
It's this guy, Dave Ritzlin. But really inspired. He does a lot of classic reprints, but he also publishes new authors. He does new anthologies. Can't recommend his stuff enough. We're starting to see some new Kickstarters that have come out very recently. I recently backed one of these. It's called Swords in the Shadows. Apparently this is going to have authors including like Brian Keene and Joe Lansdale in it, if I'm correct, who are a couple big names. You've got a couple great podcasts going on right now. You've got Rogues in the House that I've been a guest on a few times. These guys have also done a spin-off anthology called The Book of Blades. And then before Rogues in the House, and you still have the Cromcast, which are three dudes that started really talking Robert E. Howard. They've branched out, but their most recent season has come back to Robert E. Howard again. So, podcasts, you've got some new magazines start up, a new Edge magazine, edited by Oliver Brackenberry. He had an issue 0. You could get it free digitally, or you could kickstart it. But he's funded the first couple issues for that, and that's sort of a contemporary take on Sword and Sorcery. I've read some good stuff by like Steve Babb, who wrote the Scalagrim character. You've got some classic authors coming back and rewriting and putting out new stuff. David C. Smith, who did these Oron books back in the 70s. He came in right at the end of the commercial renaissance, unfortunately, but has been republished, and also wrote a great new novel called Sometime Lofty Towers. Earlier in the show, there's a guy named Scott Odin who's doing some great work. There's a Howard Andrew Jones who's amazing. He's the editor also of Tales from the Magician's Skull magazine, yes, which I subscribe to. Recommend that. I am really fond of a guy by the name of Skylar Hernstrom, though. Skylar has written a book called Thune's Vision. I'm going to mispronounce it. The Eye of Sonu, Sounnu. You can get that from DMR Books. You can get both of those editions from DMR Books, I believe. He's awesome. He channels a lot of... I really like his writing style, I think, is what's most compelling with me. He reminds me of a little bit of Jack Vance, a little bit of Robert E. Howard. There's a lot to talk about here.
Yeah.
With contemporary, but I guess I would say, go in and check out Whetstone, and you can network with a lot of these folks and learn about what's going on. And if you're interested in writing, if you're interested in reading some contemporary stuff, yep.
It very much feels like how maybe Weird Tales would have felt back in the day. Especially the server. Definitely feels like that. You have all... And it's even bigger now, because you have like hundreds of people talking about history, asking questions.
Yeah, you do.
It's one of the best.
It's a wonderful community.
It's one of the best communities I've been a part of, and I've been on the internet for a very long time. None come close to Whetstone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope you like
You
the
know,
Jeebus out of it.
it's a kind group of people too, and you know, like different opinions are definitely encouraged. But you don't see the usual internet trollery like you see in a lot of sites. You know, it's people that have mutual respect for each other. It's a welcoming community, and that's what you want to see, because I've seen too many communities fall from infighting, political divisions that we see in the world today. Some of the stuff that just you can't recover from, you know, because it gets personal. I think because that genre, that this community sticks to sword and sorcery, there's a mutual love of it. People know what you're getting into. You don't just. That's what I like about Discord too. Like these are like groups that you kind of have to hear about to get into them. You know, you can't just stumble across that server. You have to find it. Usually, someone shared a link. People that do come in, they sort of get announced, you know, and we can welcome them to the community. And there are some guidelines for participation, but the dialogue inevitably always comes back to sword and sorcery, and it's what you need. You know, it's what I mentioned Armor earlier. It's sort of like a letters column in these old magazines. People could talk about the genre. That's how the genre was born, and it was born in that conversation. Fritz, Leiber, Michael Moorcock. Let's have some back and forth. What is this stuff? What do we want to call it? What constitutes it? You know, and from that conversation, you know, we've got 60 subsequent years of amazing output. I really appreciated the interview, though, man. This was great. Thank you for talking to me today. This was a lot of fun. And we rambled. We covered a lot of ground here. I hope I didn't bore people too much, but
I don't think you will. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to obviously be cheesy or anything, but your book was great. I really enjoyed reading it. It's one of the very few non-fiction books I actually finished.
Yeah, thanks, man. The labor of love. I enjoyed writing it, and there will at some point. It's not coming soon. I haven't even begun it, but I'm planning a second edition. You know, I've discovered more, and there is more current stuff coming out, and you know, I had to leave some stuff on the cutting room floor just because I never would have finished it if I just kept going. And people have said, how come you didn't cover X author, or do more on the small press magazines? And I would have loved to have done all that stuff, but I never would have finished the damn book if I just pursued every niche corner of sword and sorcery. Like, why didn't you cover the Warner magazines that came out that had? And I'm like, well, I at some point I had to pick my battles.
You're also working on a heavy metal book, also, because you obviously are a big fan of heavy metal.
I'm a big metal fan. It's not going to be anything like Flame and Crimson, though. Flame and Crimson it's a history, right? It's non-fiction. This is going to be a lot more biographical. Okay. A lot more of my life. But that's one of my other loves. I've got a couple loves. Sword and sorcery, obviously. Heavy metal's another one. You know, I grew up with Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and Black Sabbath, Metallica, Megadeth, Anthrax, some of the thrash bands, Pantera, Slayer. That's about as heavy as I would go. Yeah. But Kiss, AC/DC, you know, a lot of that hard rock, rushing up to metal stuff. So, a lot of concerts in my history. A lot of CDs that I've listened to, sustained some hearing damage, had a ton of fun along the way, and there's a story I want to tell there. So that's my current project that I'm working on.